On the panel, starting from my left, is Dr. Nathalie Teitler, has a PhD in Latin American poetry from King's College from 2000. Is director of Complete Works, which promotes diversity and equality in UK poetry. And she's also currently compiling an anthology of young contemporary Argentine poets. On her left is Karen McCarthy Woolf, who's currently working on a PhD at Royal Holloway. She's born in London to an English mother, Jamaican father, and is the recipient of the Glenna Lushire Prairie Schooner Prize, as well as a doctoral scholarship at Royal Holloway. She's working on new ways of writing about nature, the city, and the sacred in the face of climate change, so not too much a small topic. In 2015, she was poet in residence at the National Maritime Museum, responding to an exhibit on migration, and her book, An Aviary of Small Birds, which came out from Carcanos in 2014, was nominated for the Fenton, Aldborough, and Ford Best First Collection Prize, and also selected as a Guardian Observer Book of the Year. To her left is Kayo. Oh, sorry. I knew I should have spoken to you earlier. Kayo Chingonyi, who has the author of 2 books. He's an associate poet at the ICA, and he's currently poet in residence at Royal Holloway, where he's working on a project to do with migration with Angus Woolf. And finally, Andrea Brady. Andrea is a professor at Queen Mary, University of London. Her books of poetry include Vacation of a Lifetime from Salt in 2001, Wildfire, Reverse Essay on Obscurity and Illumination from Krupskaya in 2010, Mutability, Scripts for Infancy from Seagull in 2012, Cut from the Rushes, Reality Street 2013, and Dompters from Bookberg 2014. Born in Philadelphia, but now lives and works in London and runs the Centre for Poetry at QM. Published widely on poetry and poetics, on ritual, embodiment, theories of the imagination, women's writing, critical theory. Currently writing a book funded by the Leave Human Trust on poetry and constraints across several historical periods. And her other scholarly works include the English funerary elegy in the 17th century, Laws in Mourning, from 2006. She's also director of the archive of the now a digital repository of recordings of poets performing their own work, and co-publisher of Bath Press. Her paper, but it will be voiced by somebody else. So, yeah, signal to me.
Okay, I'll jump in at some point. Just to explain, Andrea's has a laryngitis problem and can speak a little bit, but may do permanent damage to her vocal cords if she speaks very loudly or for a long period of time. And we have similar accents, so it's all
Great. So I wanted to start by picking up one of the things from this morning, which was the work of Complete Works. And since you're next to me, I wonder whether you want to tell us something about Complete Works and its project.
Right. I'm not sure how much was said this morning, so hopefully I won't be repeating everything. As some of you know, Complete Works is an organisation that promotes quality and diversity-rich poetry. It was formed as a response to the Free Verse Report. How many people have read the Free Verse Report or know of it? Okay, Free Verse Report was published in 2007, and that was the report that stated that less than 1% of poets published by major presses were either black or Asian. And the report was because Bernardine Evaristo went to the Arts Council and said that there needed to be some research and work done in this. And then she went to spread the word and literature organisation, and they started the Complete Works, which I was then the project manager for. The first round was extremely successful, and then I took it forward as the director. It's now an independent arts organisation, and we have 2 of the fellows from the second round, Karen and Kayo. So which is fabulous. They're quite wonderful, have far more interesting things to say than I do. But basically what we found last year was that the figure had gone from less than 1% to 8%, which still isn't huge, but it is an 800% difference in 7 years, which is pretty significant. Next year I'm going to be publishing an updated version of the Free Verse Report, and I'm anticipating that the level will be at 12%. So that's quite exciting. As some of you will know, the T.S. Eliot winner, Sarah Howe, was also a Complete Works poet. 3 out of 5 of the Forward Prize nominees for first collection, including Karen, were also from the complete works. So there have been some real gains in terms of diversity. That's not to say that the battle is won, it certainly isn't. There are a lot of issues, particularly around the way it's framed in national press or lack of national press coverage. I think there are also a lot of issues around what people are expecting from diversity, particularly publishers. I think there's too much pressure for poets who are coming from a certain background to write representing that background, whereas they should be free, I think, to write in any way they want to, whether it's very traditionally British or whether it's extremely experimental or whatever it is. So I have prepared little flyers with some of the figures on and information about the complete works, just because it's not that easy to remember everything. I only remember it because I've said it about 5 million times, and I did the research. So we are now embarking on the 3rd round, which is very exciting, and we're putting together the long list at the moment. Fantastic range of poets, really, really exciting range of backgrounds, everything from Egyptian, Asian, we've got a Native American, all of them are UK residents, but we've got people who really have an incredible range, and even more exciting, we've got a lot of experimental poets and a lot of political poets, which makes me quite excited because it's nice to see people really engage in different ways with diversity. So, some of the poets are not engaging with race as a political discourse, which is absolutely fine, but others are really taking it on board. Obviously, there's been a huge impact from Claudia Rankin, but also a lot of people saying they were inspired by Sarah Howe, Mona Archie and Karen, and the others from the first couple of rounds. So what will happen is over the next 2 years, these 10 poets selected, there have been 20 before, will be supported. There'll be another Blood Axe anthology. There have been 2 Blood Axe anthologies so far, so if anybody wants a copy, just let me know and I'll see if I can get one over to you. And they were very successful and launched at the South Bank. This time it is a national campaign, so most of the poets will be from outside London, and we're going to have launches at Manchester as well as in London. And we are also going to be having a big conference at Goldsmiths next year about race and poetry, so hopefully a lot of you guys will be involved in that. Hopefully Andrea will also come down and do something, and I'm hoping that will be an international conference as well. That's when the report will be launched, and a lot of the papers will be in PM review, so there's going to be quite nice coverage of it. I've invited Spread the Word to come down and present their findings on diversity in fiction, because they've done some fantastic work around that. And I was just talking to Andrea in the lunch break about how I think it's important that we look at diversity in the whole, although obviously I'm very much fixed in the poetry. I think it's really useful to look at it in the larger framework as well. So that's, I think, probably enough information that you will go to sleep.
Thank you very much for that. Karen, I want to follow up either saying about your experience with complete work or about the right representing background. So you feel that.
Yeah, I suppose I'm here in a way, I feel there are a few strands to my presence. One as a poet, one as an editor, and one as a sort of fellow of the complete works as well. And that kind of crosses into my work as an editor as well. I was interested just thinking about, for me, really, what sort of straddles all of those strands is this idea of thinking about the presence of race as political discourse in terms of how it might impact on my poetics as an editor. So, this idea of, which is always there, I feel, the kind of burden of representation. Is it a burden? Is it an opportunity? For me, I guess it's sort of part of expressing a poetry of witness, and Nathalie, you were saying that for the complete works there's a lot more political poetry. So this idea that we might have, the ideas around identity and expressions of identity and how that manifests could be via content. So in 2006, I wrote a play about Dido Lindsay. They made the film about her belle, who lived at Kenwood House, a mixed race woman who lived at Kenwood House in the 1760s, and that was a very kind of thematic, narrative, historical investigation of my own cultural background, via drama. And then my book, An Aviary of Small Birds, is a book of elegies about, it's autobiographical, it's about full-term stillbirth. And so although kind of identity and race as a narrative, that's not the focus of that book at all. But what I realised, in fact, is that for me, as a poet, form is often where my relationship with form in my work is very much, I've always been interested in hybrid approaches, about a hybridity between the lyric and perhaps some sort of more experimental techniques, tropes that I might bring to the work. And I really think, that for me, in a sense, and I'm always very interested in this liminality in my work, and that might sort of come out through the form rather than the content or the subject. So I think it's inevitable in a way that it expresses for me, because it's an expression of myself, and as a poet, I think all of our work as artists is an expression of ourselves. So that's there. But it doesn't necessarily, and I think it's also maybe in the geographies and where the work is located, and in terms of our reading and what we read out to, who we connect with as a community, and how we consider, the paradigm into which we write our work. So those are some of the ideas. So, so for me, I was just at the National Maritime Museum, and I was responding to an exhibition on migration this summer. Anyway, one of the things I said I wanted to do was part of that, which they were kind of a little bit doubtful about at first, and I had to sort of talk them round into it. So I really want to write about gentrification, which is hugely important for me. They said, it's just not relevant, Karen. I said, it is. Anyway, so we had this sort of, and then it became this idea that it would be around displacement. And for me, when I'm working, what I really want to do is to emotionally connect. So in any commission, I always want this emotional connection with the subject. And that needs to be authentic to my own experience. And I realised that, in fact, that was my own most deeply felt experience of a physical displacement and an economic displacement that I'm seeing here in London. And that comes back to this idea of the poetry of witness that I want to write, which might have issues around identification within that, with identity, but it's not paramount. But it's always going to be there as a shaping force. And I think that's also something how you play.
Robert, can you remind me of the question that you
asked? There were two questions.
Yeah.
The first one, thank you for that.
Yes, it was, sorry. No me.
The two questions. One was about your experience with complete works. Secondly, whether you felt also there was a pressure to write as a representative, whether you feel comment on that.
Okay. So I guess the title of our discussion is Race and Representation, which brings up a lot of questions for me, and I guess in that representation, I'll go into that in a second. But complete works, I had a skepticism about complete works before I went onto the program, and I met with Nathalie at the South Bank Centre, I think, and we just had a long conversation about what complete works was supposed to be doing. And some of the reservations I had were around how this program, which is about kind of expanding diversity in publishing, also serves to create a kind of a situation in which certain writers are being seen in terms of their cultural identity, they're being identified and picked out for that. And I guess I had difficulties with joining a group that was part of that, but at the same time I came to realise through being in the Complete Works that it was also an opportunity to affirm some of the stuff that Karen is talking about, which is to say that there are some people who engage politically with the notion of race in a very direct way, in a very referential way, who make arguments about race and racial politics in their writing. And then there are people who, by the very act of writing, are interrogating the kind of racial paradigms we live under. And by the very act of writing landscape poetry, for instance, as somebody who, if you went into the English landscape, would be met with confusion and hostility sometimes. Benjamin Zephaniah lives in the countryside, and he spoke about how he tried to sell something in the classified ads of a newspaper. And he phoned up the guy to arrange the meeting, and he was saying to himself, well, you can't miss me because like I'm quite tall, dreadlocks. And the guy said to him, oh no, I don't do anything with blacks, which was a very strange thing. But he was saying living in that space where blackness is such a different thing for people, he sometimes experiences those things. So I think British poetry publishing and the establishment of it, which is to say the major publishers, which is what the Free Verse report was based on, the kind of like 5 big publishing houses that like get reviews in newspapers, who are covered in radio, who have coverage. Like if you go out in the street and talk to people about what poetry is, they might be able to mention Faberty, they might have read a Black's book, they might have seen a Jonathan Cake book. So I guess getting a wider diversity into those kind of presses is important, and I think Complete Works really does that. And I thought it did that by just like knocking on doors and getting numbers up, but it actually does that by creating a community in which you feel free to write about whatever the hell you want, even if people look at you from without and say you shouldn't write about that. So it was really cool to just be like with other people who were doing totally different things and feeling that I could, if I wanted to, explore other areas. And also I could write about race if I wanted to. I didn't have to feel that race was off limits if I wanted to be taken seriously as a poet, because like there's this paradigm in which you can't write about certain identity politics issues. You have to pretend you don't have a body, you have to pretend you don't have a sex, you have to pretend all sorts of things in order to like be seen as a pure poet who is writing from like an unmediated, pure position. And that position is not unmediated because it's quite often a normative white position. So being part of Complete Works really forced me to rethink about all of those issues and gave me like confidence to challenge some of these things in my writing directly. In terms of representation, which I said I'd come back to, there's an American poet and scholar called Fred Moten, whose work I really love. And he has 2 quotations that I've been thinking about a lot lately. Is the history of black radicalism provides an alternative history of Western society, which I think goes into what Clementine was saying earlier, is that once we get into that hidden history, we're actually experiencing history in its fullness rather than the history we've been given. And then the other quote from Moten is, shame is the modality in which blackness is lived. This is something he said at a conference at Goldsmiths, I think a year or 2 ago. And I think my experience of representation in poetry and publishing has been a lot to do with this notion of shame. I came into poetry as a performance poet, quote unquote, as doing poetry slams, winning poetry slams. And I was encouraged to feel shame about that by a kind of white establishment, because poetry slams are non-literary, they're competitive, they focus on the body and performance and these like techniques of artifice which actors use, not poets. So there's a sense in which shame comes back into, it's what you're supposed to feel if you're writing in a certain way, from a certain perspective. So yeah, I guess for me the most radical thing I can do is affirm and present blackness in as complex a way as I can, which can include like writing about very banal things, but by dint of the fact that people tell me I can't have a mango in a poem. By dint of that fact alone, my putting mangoes in the poem and talking about what the mango tastes like the poem stinking of mango juice, by dint of that, you get into a radical space. So that's what I'm really interested in at the moment.
Could I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
To do with the project you're engaged with, about migration and bilingualism.
Yeah.
And whether you could say something like that as well.
Yeah, so I'm working at, within HARC at Royal Holloway, which is a research centre focusing on the humanities, broadly speaking. But I'm looking mostly at poetry, and I'm thinking about how poets can be activists. Just what I've been talking about in the very act of writing, or in what they write about, or in where they place their writing. And in terms of migration, I'm thinking about the migrations across nations and within nations as well. And also the nations that come out of literature itself. So stuff like the Scots that Hugh McDermott uses, which is, it's not a real representation of Scots because it takes in lots of different versions of Scots. And by creating like a literary language in that way, he's created a nation. And then we can get into Kamal Brathwaite's nation language and Caribbean poets. And I'm particularly interested in how African diaspora poets from Africa, how they can represent that, because there's such a diverse range of languages. So how can you begin to get into different versions of English that have been made from all these different languages? So in the course of that project, I'll be looking at all of these things and meeting with researchers in different areas of migration and poetics and the humanities, and using that to write new, creative and critical material.
Thank you very much. Now for Andrea.
Okay, I'm Andrea right now. Okay, so who has kindly prepared some points? Should I?
Yeah, good. Why don't you stand next
I'll go stand next to Andrea. Okay. Hi. Okay. So,
just say it.
okay. I think the sociality of poetry is extremely important to thinking about how to dismantle its structure of white supremacy. We need to think about how to build spaces in which bodies of color will not be out of place, and this entails thinking about how the spaces we currently inhabit have been produced and reproduced as a sea of whiteness. Partly, this will entail thinking about how a person moves from a private reader or writer of poetry to someone who attends readings, to someone who is invited to read, and then who is invited to be published, and also all the other trajectories by which a person travels from being interested in poetry to being publicly recognized as a maker of poetry, and why that trajectory seems to be cut or cut off by white supremacy at each of its stages. In the UK, poetry is segregated at multiple points. Canonical white poetry is segregated from post-colonial writing on syllabi and within research groups. Spoken word scenes are segregated from avant-garde scenes. Slams are segregated from academic conferences and university-sponsored festivals. The mainstream is segregated from the nonconformist tradition. Presses and journals are segregated along lines of place and genealogies. These are racialized boundaries between kinds of labor and kinds of bodies, and not just between genres or styles. They produce an ethics of competition rather than hospitality. Recently, I've been trying to be more hospitable. In order to launch the Center for Poetry at Queen Mary, I decided to host a 3-day international poetry festival which would celebrate the poetry of the East End of London. The notion was to assemble a gloriously various range of poets who would celebrate local traditions and their connection to global ones. It would help the university to think about its relation to its location, a relation which is under strain for various reasons. The increasing tuition fees, which have eroded our long-standing ability to recruit BME students from Tower Hamlets, a borough of incredible diversity, intense social and economic deprivation, below average educational outcomes, and encroaching hipster gentrification. The Globe Road Festival would also be an occasion for us at the university to learn about this locality and to extend our hospitality to our neighbors. With Stephen Quincy Jones, I spent a year working to build relationships with local organizations, listening to their needs and preferences and taking their guidance on who and what to program. To use the jargon of higher education, we were engaged in knowledge exchange, not its transfer from up high to down below. Such exchange taught us not to be too proud of the gift we thought we were giving. They taught us about how the university's architecture fortifies itself against the community. This was doubly reinforced when we realized, as the festival began, that the foundation stone in the hall where we were hosting it had been laid by Leopold II, King of the Belgians. Or about how engaging young people in caring about poetry requires a long-term investment in building up a relationship with a particular school, teacher, and class. Hospitality does not mean dumping your generosity in someone's vicinity and expecting them to take it up. I think the program we eventually developed was interesting and robust. We had writers from Bangladesh, Trinidad, Korea, Somalia, Algeria, and Benin. Carolyn Bergvall performed and talked about drift. It was an extraordinary set of readings, almost entirely by people of color, though we did not advertise the festival in those terms. Of course, as the organizer, I was in pain for most of the weekend, excruciated by what didn't go to plan. But I was also surprised at how dejected I was when the festival ended. Was I disappointed that I hadn't solved British poetry's white supremacy problem in a weekend? Secretly, maybe a bit. But there was a particular moment which my dejection kept hovering around. It was an afternoon of readings by the Shangati Literary Society, a local Bengali poetry group which has been going for over 20 years. They regularly attract hundreds of people to their performances, which involve music and recitations of poetry by Bengali heroes like Tagore, as well as the poems written by members of the community. On this occasion, there were around 90 people there, and the young woman who was the MC repeatedly extended the hospitality of the community to the audience, expressing the society's collective hope that the poetry we were hearing could give us an introduction to the community and its values. Everyone takes a turn reading a poem. The children are there messing about, dancing and gossiping and doing splits. Of course, not every poem was great, but poetry was evidently part of the life of this community, the means of its self-expression and coming together, and it produced and affirmed relationships which lasted over decades. It was a living tradition of a kind that the Millwall stylings of the British radical poetry fan, everyone hates us, we don't care, had led me to believe no longer existed. It was an event which taught me a great deal about what poetry can still be. And, other than me and Quinn, there were only 2 white people in the entire room. Even though the Shangati event was embedded in the middle of the Globe Road program, between a walking tour and a long table discussion, no one from the avant-garde poetry community, none of my people, came. Undoubtedly, this was not a decision based on white supremacy, but on questions of style and taste, but the effect was the same. This sounds like an accusation, and perhaps it is, though it is one I'd level at myself as well. We're all busy. We can't go to everything. But I felt on a fundamental level that if we want to change the conditions of white supremacy which predominate in this community, and which deeply impoverish our poetics, us white poets and readers have to put our bodies in spaces where they can listen to the voices of people of color. Can it really be that simple? No, of course not. Hospitality is a temporary measure which leaves the hierarchy of relations intact. One is the host, the other the guest. It is not the same as redistribution. And I will give that back to you. And turn it over here.
Thank you both very much. What I propose at this point is straight open to you for questions for the panelists. To put you all on the spot, yes.
So I was just thinking, are there more diverse ways of thinking of models of diversity, and I hate that word. For example, if you go to, you're talking about South Asia, I mean, in Pakistan you will have, say, a truck, and a truck will have a truck painted with an Allama Iqbal poem, which draws from Milton and Nietzsche, and that's not something you can see in a truck in Britain. Or, Bangladesh you'll have poems on rickshaws or on a wall or mule, and say pop culture, like the things in the charts will sing Allama Iqbal poems, and again you're not going to see like Ted Hughes and like the top 10, like whatever. So I just think that this administrative model of like Arts Council England and grants and blah blah blah, which everyone's guilty of sucking up to. Perhaps that is not. Perhaps we can learn. I mean, things like even reggae and dub, they're so intuitive. These are other models of actually hospitality and integrating and diversifying that. So are we using a white model of diversity to begin with, and maybe we actually could learn, maybe the hospitality is not, the actual structure and model is something we can actually borrow from and might improve some of these areas. If that makes sense.
Yes, as a statement, sort of thing. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? But not, are you saying that, what's the question? Are we just looking at a white model of diversity?
I mean, there's a model of Arts Council assessing things quantitatively in an administrative form, coming up with statistics, and repeating that and hoping for a better outcome. And there's other less developed state structures, say in South Asia or in like the Caribbean, less administrative forms of, less managerial forms of hospitality and diversifying, and whether we could borrow from that, and then that would actually improve the
diversity of platform in a way you're thinking as well, when you're talking about rickshaws and seeing poetry in different places, so poetry in public places that might not necessarily be connected to how you would receive poetry as art, just as something that you see as part of billboard, for example.
For example, the photography biennale in Bangladesh, Chobi Mela, which is one of the largest in the world and is run on a zero budget, is done on rickshaws, and rickshaws are going around the city. And even though in East London, which is probably the most racially segregated, unequal, the area around Kumera where you have like white hipster, class, and the Bangladeshi or Somali thing is separate. But actually, if that makes sense.
It does to me, and in a way this is a very interesting occasion because it's one of the few occasions that different kinds of people are coming together in the poetry scene, and by that I mean people who are working in very different styles or relationships to the kind of organs of public recognition, and obviously I'm coming out of the more kind of experimental small press kind of side of things, and have therefore a suspicion about prizes and the awards and that whole economy. So while I recognize that it's a really brilliant thing that Complete Works has made these kind of really important inroads in gaining public recognition for poetry of colour, I also, I look at what happened to Sarah Howe after she won the Elliott Prize and think, I want no part of that, and that the kind of response, the misogynist and racist response that she got was really horrifying and showed, this sort of one of the kind of poison chalice side of some of these awards. So we're coming to, but having said that, within the avant-garde community, I think that there is a danger that we think, well, we're doing something that's so radical formally, that's sufficient. We're part of this, long history of a kind of radical struggle against commodification, and that's obvious in the way that we publish our books and the way we circulate them, and that we don't pay much attention to the kind of mainstream economies of attention that aren't accessible to us, but we don't want them anyway. And as a consequence, we are not accountable we don't take public money, so we don't have that accountability, which is often foisted upon people from the Arts Council. Not to say that that's the only reason one ought to be accountable, obviously, but it's a mechanism for measuring accountability, perhaps. And we also don't bother to learn from all of the work that is being done, I think, in other private communities to resolve some of these inadequacies, you know, and so there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of techniques and methods that have been developed within the realms of performance poetry and so forth that people in the avant-garde poetry, you know, are not engaging with at all. So the notion of mentoring, for example, which Complete Works has developed so powerfully, is not something that people in the avant-garde world are kind of engaged in any way.
I think, I mean, I just want to sort of talk to that a tiny bit because I view myself as a lyric poet in many ways, but yet I'm constantly, I mean, I don't know, I'm always thinking about, for me, a platform, a rickshaw is just a platform, it's like a form, it could be a sonnet, it could be whatever, it's just another form in which we receive poetry and what we want to do in that space, you know. So I kind of, I don't see those divisions as, you know, there's something that, you know, I could just be water to flow through them in a way for me. I really see it like that. And so, you know, I've made poetry as an installation, but I still see, you know, but then if I'm writing for a book, this is my form, and what am I doing with this page? That's what I'm going to work to there, in that space. But equally, I would be interested in, you know, kind of collecting poetry as data and turning it into a machine and cranking it out of the river or something. You know what I mean? That's just as much interesting. So I don't know, you were sort of saying about ideas of style and taste and performance and how all of these can be kind of become very separated. But I kind of argue I don't really think they are in a lot of ways, but it's more about the communities and the gatherings might be more separate, but actually the, you know, in terms of what we might want to read or produce is less so. I think it's more fluid. I don't know, that was just a...
I'd like to say something also about that division between kind of spoken word and different platforms. We have poets like Woolf, who's a fellow of Complete Works, and obviously her ability to reach people online is, and through Twitter, is extraordinary and actually create a community. By writing a poem on female genital mutilation, which was on The Guardian, which had over 500,000 people reading it, which forced it to be debated in the House of Commons. So I think to say that, you know, the kind of more elite poets can't also be community activists or can't also have a space is not quite the right thing.
I didn't say that they couldn't be community activists. No, I didn't say that at all.
Okay, it just sounded like there was a distinction made between kind of spoken word and published or paid poets.
No. I mean, you know, one of the things I was trying to say in that paper is that there are lots of different forms of fracture, I think, which are to do with communities in which the work is being read, performed, and reproduced. And so, you know, you must have the experience that you often know many of the people in the room, in the rooms where you're going to perform. And those rooms and those spaces are kind of markers of what we think of as separations of style or genre, but are also oftentimes racialized and otherwise segregated spaces.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean in relation to that. Coming back to your idea of platforms, and yeah, I guess if you think of publishing as the only means by which you can, that your literary value can be tested, then it very much limits the scope of poetry. Whereas, like, when I'm promoting, like when I'm putting together an event, I'm associate poet at the ICA at the moment, and we had, to all intents and purposes, an experimental poetry event. There were 4 sound poets, or poets who privileged sound. Not necessarily privileged sound over the meaning, but they look at how the sound of their poems generates meaning, as well as kind of the theme and the kind of referential meaning in the poems. And just having that thing at the ICA, as opposed to like a reading venue that I would normally have like a literary reading with a certain kind of audience, having it there brought in like art students, tourists, people who were just visiting, people who were interested in like Anthony Joseph's work because of his connection to the Caribbean, people interested in what Amy Evans does in terms of like avant-garde poetics. We had lots of different kinds of people together, like 170 of them, and like I never ever do readings like that very often. Like if I do a reading, either like the room's mostly white people or mostly black people, but it's never both. Like it's very rare for it to be both. So I really understand what you mean about changing the platform and allowing that to kind of shift the perspective. Because I think people negotiate poetry really often. Like everybody knows like 4 bars of Kanye West. Like, everybody does, whether they hate him or dislike him. But like, no, but even you do. Like you might think that you don't, but it's in you in some space because it's like everywhere.
Okay, I probably do, but then
it's like everywhere. Like if someone said it to you, it would. You'd be like, I've heard that somewhere. But like, if someone quoted like the wasteland to you, like in the street, like not everybody would be like, yeah, I've heard that somewhere. So like, I feel like as soon as you push it into a different context, it immediately like broadens what you're doing, even without changing the work in any particular way, I suppose. And it doesn't even have to be like a commercial context. It could be like guerrilla activity, like reading the poems on a bus, whether people want you to go.
I think there's an opening space for cross artwork as well. I'm doing a series of dance poetry films. I did a film based on Karen's, and I've been amazed at how many dance companies and organisations around the world have asked me to come and show them or come and talk to them. And these include Latin American dance companies, you know, African American, every single kind. So I think there are other art forms which may be a little bit more open, and those are really interesting platforms and really good ways of getting new audiences and breaking down a lot of the boundaries, the preconceptions, because they don't have any about poetry, or, you know, they have this idea of, okay, poetry's for me or not for me, but they come to it quite fresh. Which is really lovely, and I think there's a lot of work to be done in that, as well as with visual arts and poetry crossovers. So again, when you're talking about platforms, I think that's definitely worth considering.
I have 5 questions, covering information. Amy, if you could go first.
Yeah, sure. I'm going to try to keep this really short because I think I'm going to talk about some of these things a little bit. But it seems to me as if there's a lot of different levels upon which the word race is being inflected, and race can mean a lot of different things, especially when we're talking about in relationship to politics. And so I guess I might separate it out, and this is just my own way of thinking about it, into questions about authority, cultural authority, spokesmanship, representation. So somebody like Obama or Kanye West, who's not necessarily, who seems to be representative of a great mass of, for example, American black people. In a way that those people don't necessarily have the feedback back in, you know, they're not writing his albums, so they're not speaking, giving an inaugural address or something like that. So that's sense of spokesmanship, authority, cultural authority, and diversity within that. Within a sort of already existing hierarchy, which can be shifted to some extent, you wonder, I mean, there's always going to be a hierarchy in a sense. Then there's a question about organizing and political organizing, which is quite different. And then there's the third level about expression and people sort of opening up people to each other, which I think is actually separate from something that we might think of as redistribution or political organizing per se, because you could say that people walking out of a room who've read, for example, like an Asian landscape poet or something aren't necessarily going to go out and change the economic system, but it's still a meaningful engagement, and I think those need to be separated out a bit when we're thinking about what race means in each of these contexts, because it really does have to do with different kind of levels of what we mean by race, I guess, or what is being produced through race, I guess, in each of these contexts, what race can give us. Or,
Any responses.
Sorry.
I could move on to the next. Would you like to introduce your question?
Yeah, sure. So I had a two-part question / two questions. First is, in response to what Andrea you were saying, in terms of, I'm very much located within the avant-garde tradition, and I was wondering, given that so much of it seems to be as a resistance to the mainstream, if there is a danger of the homogenization of avant-garde politics? So I'm thinking very much in terms of, say, the recent sort of this sort of need to engage with misogyny within the avant-garde, for example, and how that might be inflected onto white supremacist structures and consolidation of racial hierarchies, and what can be done to challenge that. And secondly, I was also wondering if, based on what everyone seems to have talked about, is this idea of why it becomes very easy to dismiss a kind of poetics that is based on identity as being very affective or being very emotional. Obviously, a long history of this with women's writing, for instance. And what are some ways in which it might be possible to reclaim this mode of affective poetics, as well as reconcile it with the sort of intellectualization that seems to be presented as an objective norm, but is obviously not an objective norm insofar as it's a white, masculine, Western norm.
What I'm looking for are instant responses. If I don't get instant responses, I know I've got lots of questions.
Can I just say that there's not just a danger of that homogenization, it's already happened. So how do we deal with that?
And also alongside that danger, there's like a danger of there's an assumption of shared values, which is really interesting. Like I've been following the Kenneth Goldsmith effect, as I like to call it. And like, yeah, one of the things Kenneth Goldsmith has said about his work is that he's trying to do some of the stuff that's been done in music with sampling, appropriation and this kind of stuff. But the issue that I have with his work is that he speaks of like an unmediated, non-editorializing voice, but the act of choice is that editorializing process in sampling. And he says there's no editorializing going on because he's not changing the stuff and it's just appropriating it. But even if you don't change it, just the act of you speaking something is a mode of appropriation that is colored by what your voice sounds like, where you're from, the privilege that you've had, all that kind of stuff. So there's like loads of like assumptions that people make when they like present certain things to do with race. They seem to think it will be okay, like, and it's fine, and a lot of people don't get challenged as well, which I find interesting. Like, of the avant-garde poets whose work I follow, there's a really interesting dynamic in which I think Hannah alluded to this earlier. Anthony Joseph is, to all intents and purposes, an avant-garde poet, but he's not part of the avant-garde poetic community, and I don't understand why, because he's been writing stuff that people. It's stuff in a mode that people are writing in for ages, like since the 90s. He's been a publisher, he works across with music, and he reads and has been influenced by all of the same people, like Olsen and everybody. Like, so yeah, it's really strange when you get that assumption of shared values, and really you need to ask what the values are, but you do get that in various scenes. And like in spoken word, there are certain assumptions, and in like the literary readings that I go to, there are certain assumptions about what is good and bad poetry. So I really like going to spaces where there's different people, because those assumptions are really like taken away. I like going to a reading where some people will clap at the end of a poem, some people will like sit silently to the end, and some people will interrupt you partway through and like talk to you about what you're reading. I like going to readings like that, but like, it's rare to have them where you have that level of a dynamic movement between audience and performer, as if they were like sharing something in the moment.
I wanted to say something also about combating homogenization. I think one of the most powerful tools is also for poets and audiences to be more aware of work in translation. And we have an illustrious translator here who I'm sure will agree that there are amazing communities and cultures which are not necessarily accessed unless you're prepared to go into spaces where there is translated work. I've worked with a lot of translations in a lot of different cultures. Latin American, for example, we have a very, very varied and political avant-garde, which is accessible to British audiences because people have translated it. But when you go to those spaces, the British poetry scene are not there. However, having said that, the mix of diversity is huge. It's like the UN. So we've got much more diversity, but not the people who are arguing about diversity, which is a little bit strange. So just perhaps a little bit more awareness that there is this huge wealth of different poetry traditions available in the UK. So.
Yeah, and to pick up that point in what Kayo said, I think people who are interested in avant-garde black radical traditions in the UK think it all happens in the US, you know, so we don't read Anthony Joseph, but we've got, we read all of the black radical poets from America, right? And I think too about you know, Harriet Mullen saying that, you know, I read my experimental poetry in front of a white audience, I read my more lyric, sort of personal poetry in front of a black audience, and the kind of problematic split that introduces into her practice, and that perhaps for us as poets, writers, performers, there's also something a little bit safer about preaching to the congregation. You know, you know who you're talking to, so you know basically what the rules of engagement are and what they're going to accept, and so it's not as risky for you to stand up and read your weird conceptual poem generated out of the computer because you know it's your people there and that's what they're expecting, or you know, or whatever, and so. It's actually, it feels much more, you feel much more vulnerable when you have to occupy those spaces where there are lots of different kinds of taste and expectations, and put your work up for judgment according to that kind of very Catholic set of interests and perspectives.
Peter, I think you're next.
Well, I'm really enjoying this conversation, so I'll try to keep it very brief. But I guess I wanted to endorse something that Andrea said a minute ago, but I think it sort of this plays into what you were all saying. I mean, the avant-garde in Britain in poetry was incredibly beleaguered and starved of resources and funds, and constantly attacked in the press and on the radio for between the 1970s to about 2000. And one of the sort of unfortunate effects of all this was that the Arts Council began to, would never fund, at least in London, never fund anything, but it would fund activities by minority groups. So it created a completely false kind of tension, I think, amongst in the poetry world. And I think it's true that the British poetry avant-garde for a long time was overwhelmingly white. And it became very suspicious of anything that saw as identity politics. And I think what you've seen in the last 15, 20 years, thank goodness, is an unwinding of that. But you know, it's cast again. It seems to me it's part of that history.
I think it's also that, you know, I suppose in a way, those ideas around otherness and being outside of the mainstream, and then, you know, how you might choose to position yourself, or whether you feel you have a choice to position yourself as outside or not, about whether that means you want to then gain access. And I also think, I mean, just sort of slipping back a tiny bit into that idea of, you know, kind of prizes and all this, I don't want to go on about that, but like, in a sense, you know, sort of publishing with certain houses brings sort of huge rafts of opportunities and commissions and, you know, money on which to spend. I'm just sort of saying that these are also sort of practicalities that people think about. And that's not to say necessarily that it gives it, you know, the qualitative aspects are, you know, they're not, that doesn't create them. You know, so I'm saying you're published by Fever, does that mean you're like, you know, 20 times more brilliant than anyone else, da 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 da? No. But what it does mean is that you have access to a whole, you know, kind of raft of opportunity that other people don't. So I'm sort of saying I think that those are the kind of things that people are thinking about also when they talk about access to the mainstream and the idea of how many will the Guardian publish your poem and, you know, who reads that. and where is your audience, and does that mean when there is a commission to do advertising billboards with poems on them and getting them, you know, onto rickshaws in London, the ones we have, whatever, taxis, then, you know, does that change that dynamic?
Yeah.
It's a bit mundane
Yeah.
in some ways to even think about it like that, but it's still there.
We're just doing the long list of complete works 3 at the moment, and one of the things that I found really, really exciting is they are the most fluid voices that I've come across, in that we have individual poets who are able to use aspects of spoken word, aspects of the avant-garde, aspects of community art, and these are also people who use multiple platforms, who have been community artists, who've done the whole range of things, and they're playing with all these different voices and things that poetry can do. And that's when I get really, really excited and think, okay, this is, you know, this is the possible future, and this looks really, really strong to me. And so I think there is the possibility of people who have the ability to play with all of these contradictions and really come out with something quite special at the end of it.
And just very quickly, the point about access I think is really important, and I was very struck by this figure in your report about how something like only 6% of BME poets are published through their own kind of social contacts, you know, and that actually, this is why I was trying to emphasize sociality in the thing that Sam read for me, is because this is also true of the avant-garde, you know, like in terms of sociality and the relationships and the points of social access that you have are very predictive in some ways of the opportunities that you get. You know, it's not just something that we say, oh, that's to do with the mainstream and the agents and, you know, all that kind of economy. It's also very much part of the avant-garde, and that's something that has to be opened up within the avant-garde economies as well.
I suspect that figure was from the 2007.
Yeah, it was the early.
Yeah, that's changed significantly.
Yeah.
Sorry, student person, you were there.
Really quickly, but I mean, there was so many tremendous things being said to resonate with everybody. But just picking up on what Nathalie said about translation, because it's the first time it's been mentioned today, I think. And if you hadn't mentioned it, I was going to mention it, because I think if we don't take wide horizons of translation as a cultural activity, not simply a translation of text to text, but as a complete wide cultural activity that happens in hospitals, that happens in schools, that happens in enormous variety of places, as well as on the written and spoken poetry. It's a prejudice. It's a very deep prejudice as deep as any other.
Thanks.
Do you have any other things to say? But thank you all.
Thanks. Your question.
I've got 2 questions. And the first is, whilst kind of acknowledging that there are important hierarchies that need to be abolished, if we utilise sort of a notion of a white, I worry if we utilise a notion of a white avant-garde as a sort of frontispiece to these conversations, do we risk imputing a hierarchy of non-interest? So if we say, oh, well, the white avant-garde poets aren't reading Susan Howe or Bonnie Capaldillo, that like loads of other people are, and isn't that more important that you know, a small group of people who pay attention to their own poetic interests aren't reading all this other poetry? I mean, I wonder more if the question could be what you guys might think about, like, what is the politics of the interaction where scenes fracture or like start to emerge or like move through each other, if that's how we could better conceive of the politics. And I was really excited by this event you described at the ICA of all these different poets coming together, and I was thinking a lot about the politics of space, of property and ownership, of like who owns these buildings where all these poets suddenly come together, and like those are often very racialized, but they're also so are the interests of some of these specific sites. So like I've got friends who are involved in a campaign to get artists and poets to not work with the Zabludovic Gallery because they support Israeli apartheid. And I was just wondering what the politics of kind of boundaries dissipating and like groups coming together like might be in those kind of spaces as people are looking into different audiences. If sounds like a...
I come from a background in community arts, so I worked for a group called Excellent Writers for many years. I worked as the refugee arts officer for the Arts Council, Refugee Council for many years. There's a huge community art scene, community poetry scene. So it's a shame that there's no representatives of that as well, because they address race in a very distinct way. They use spaces like hospitals, community centres. There's an awful lot of that going on, so I think it would be really useful to kind of build the bridges, because it's not that it doesn't exist, it's just that there isn't as much awareness of it as there could be. So that's one answer.
I guess there needs to be like a sensitive movement into certain spaces, because certain spaces are safe spaces for particular communities, and you might have an event there which attracts a wider community from the area, and then that gets lost, that sense in which this space has been built over a long period of time, and that kind of stuff can get lost sometimes, just by the fact that there are lots of people coming together. So I think in those instances it's useful to have like a context set up that kind of explores what that space has been used for, why it's important, why its history is important, who is involved in that history. And it's really, I just find it really interesting to go into spaces where like 200 years ago it would have been unthinkable for me to stand. I really love that feeling. So yeah, I'm always interested in those kinds of spaces which haven't had kids in hoodies in them for a while. I just like that notion. And we were talking about cognitive dissonance, I think it was mentioned before. I love presenting that in that sense. Yeah, there's this concept in a book called Looking for Leroy, the author of which I've forgotten temporarily. But the concept is like legibility, the ways in which people read your physical appearance and make assumptions about where you're supposed to be. And I think as a person of colour who's writing, your physical appearance can sometimes be given away by your name, for instance, and your race is read into loads of things that you kind of do. So I think in relation to your first question, why is it important? I guess if there is like a scene which is seen as the opposition, or like a different literary tradition to the mainstream, and they're seen as like the leading exponents, and they have like an emotive name, like people used to use the idea of like a British poetry revival and these kind of like very emotive names. This is the true poetry, we have it, it's over here. If there are people claiming that, and by the same token they don't like claim all of the people that might belong to their group, when those people very naturally seem to belong, when I see them and see, oh okay, so how come that person isn't? Yeah, when that happens I start to get suspicious. It's not that I think if you belong to a certain scene you should read certain people because they also belong to it, but it's kind of like there are certain glaring omissions.
Yeah.
It's more about that really,
Yeah.
than anything else.
Okay. Fine. Very last question, sorry.
I don't know if it's a question, it's just interesting what Kayo is saying. But talking about this glaring emissions, I mean, when I talked to Anthony Joseph about this, I mean, he's so busy and in demand internationally in all sorts of ways that it's utterly irrelevant whether, sorry for being rude, but like a group of old white men in a very small pub with 5 audience members know about him or not. It's really irrelevant because his work is international and is talking to international writers. But also, I think there's also a thing about performance here, and that's that when you look at Anthony Joseph's stuff on the page, it's extraordinary in his pain. He was doing all sorts of stuff visually, but when he performs, he's a slick performer. He's a great performer, and you can't always hear the innovation that you can see on the page. And there's a weird thing within avant-garde that actually the rough poetry reading, the rough performance, from the discussions I've had with people like John Paul, is what they're aiming for. John Paul talks about a minimal performance, a minimal poetry reading that's not performance at all, that's referring back to the page, it's all about the page. Sorry, I just wanted to rip on that, usually, but I mean, having kind been interested in the avant-garde, now I'm just feeling like that, well, that's irrelevant. And there's really exciting generations now programming work that's going across all of these things, and I feel like it's changing hugely. It's going to keep changing with this current generation.
I suppose what was motivating me 9 months ago was just a feeling that we were also in danger of losing people along the way. You know, I was going to mention the names Bill Griffiths and Maggie O'Sullivan, who never had any publicity. And Maggie's work was deemed of no literary merit by the Royal Literary Fund at one point. and so I hope that this sort of opening space will include.
I love Maggie O'Sullivan.
I hear you.
I'd like to thank the panel very much for this very stimulating discussion.